Welcome to this afternoon session arranged by PARSE. I'm just here to say a few words about what PARSE is, for those of you that do not know. It's a publishing and seminar and conference initiative run by the school, 3 art schools within the Faculty of Fine, Applied and Performing Arts here at Gothenburg University. So it's the Craft and Design School, it's Academy Balan, the art school, and then the School of Dance and Theatre. And this session will be moderated by Kenneth Hemmele, who will present briefly the theme and the program for this afternoon. So welcome and thank you for coming.
Yes, that was very brief. We will start right away with the first presentation, but first, before that, I just wanted to say that some of you may, although when I look at the audience, I think it may not be so relevant for many of you, but some of you may think that financial crises are exceptions to what happens in the global economic world, but they are not. And one of the books that tell you very much and very decidedly how frequent economic crises and financial crises are during several hundred years of capitalist development and global economic development has a very nice title. It is called This Time is Different. So every time you hear that the economy is doing well...
Try this one instead.
The economy is doing well. Every time you hear this, that the economy is doing well, I felt like I lost sort of the basis of my speech now. Should I use this one? Yeah. Every time you hear that this time is different, think that has been said very many times before. And the other day I read an article by a very well-informed economist, an American economist, discussing when the next financial crisis will arrive. And have no fear, because it won't happen this year, he says. And it won't happen next year. But by 2020, we will have a similar financial crisis like the one we had in 2008. So what we're doing today is discussing the relationship between these recurrent crises and the way that these crises have an impact on and are reflected in and on art, movies, and different cultural expressions. And we will start right away. Some of you may have been looking in that direction and seen that there's coffee standing over there. I will open that coffee when we shift the speakers. We'll start with, as you can see, Leigh Berge, who has already put her PowerPoint, starting how to abstract economic history and cultural analysis. Leigh is an assistant professor of English at the City University of New York. And you will be the first to take this order, please.
Okay, is that volume good for people? Is that, yeah? Okay. Well, first of all, Erling, thank you for inviting me. I've never been to Sweden before, so I'm very excited to be here. And Kenneth, thank you for your introduction and for responding. And really, I think getting to travel and meet colleagues and faculty and students in different countries and at different universities is one of the highlights of the profession. So I'm just so happy to be here. And today I want to give a talk called How to Abstract Economic History and Cultural Analysis. And I'm gonna start with the presumption that perhaps there's no more of a crucial step in economically oriented cultural analysis than the decision of when and how to render certain aspects of economic life empirical and other aspects abstract. It is the relationship between the empirical and the abstract that often forms the basis of an argument, and that indeed sets a foundation for the mediation of the economy by culture and vice versa. That problem forces cultural critics to ask, when should the economic be thematized? How should it be periodized? When should we rely on static or formalized economic norms? When should the economy be rendered as empirical, and when should it be rendered as more broadly metaphorical? It matters on what level of abstraction these questions are staged, since that level often generates the content of cultural analysis. Today, I'll present 2 case studies in abstraction. One from my first book, Scandals and Abstraction, Financial Fiction of the Long 1980s, which came out a few years ago. And one from my forthcoming book, which is not yet out, but will come out next year, Wages Against Artwork, Decommodified Labor, and the Rise of Socially Engaged Art. The first case study turns towards finance, which is often described as abstract or complex, and its mediation in literature and culture. The second book towards its attention towards labor, which is almost never described as abstract or complex, but rather which is often overly concretized, made very simple, made very easy to ascertain. And I'll look at this mediation in contemporary installation and performance art. I hope to provide a kind of reflection on how and when abstractions in economically oriented cultural analysis work, and I'll be very excited to be in conversation with all of you after my presentation. So, in humanities-oriented academic discourse, abstraction is perhaps the most commonly employed category used to describe finance, and abstract the most common adjective. This is such a broad and multidimensional claim that it immediately calls for clarification. Foremost, what do we refer to with finance, and what do we refer to with abstraction? For expediency's sake, I'm going to rely on a definition of finance offered by the American sociologist Greta Krippner. She claims that finance refers to demarcations of manifest structured time and operations that, quote unquote, refer to activities relating to the provision or transfer of liquid capital in expectation of future interest, dividends, or capital gains. So, what do a credit card, a derivative contract, and a 10-year treasury bill have in common? They all participate in a temporal displacement and recuperation, and they're all mediated by an expectation of future profit and current payment. In humanities discourses, however, one could also say that what defines finance is its abstract character. This adjective is used regularly in conversation, at conferences, and in writing. While the anthropologist Karen Ho has cautioned against the term's overuse, that call has gone unheeded in the humanities. With regard to finance, the trope of the abstract has been employed to mediate between humanities writing and economic writing, between humanities-based approaches and social scientific approaches. While the word finance itself may be cataloged and defined, we'll have no such luck with the twins of abstract and abstraction. In aesthetics, abstraction denominates an aesthetic mode of non-figurative representation. In social theory, it indicates something not fully realizable by a particular. These orientations share a habit of thought, to be sure, but they're also marked by a divergence of aims. In aesthetics, the abstract highlights a perception. A certain immediate figuration is lost so that other properties of the medium may be brought into sharp relief. In social theory, abstraction indicates a metonymic reach, in which the incomplete representation stands in for something larger that cannot be represented. The critic, I guess he's a historian, Timothy Mitchell, for example, argues that the economy, the phrase the economy itself, is a recent historical abstraction used to designate a diversity of local and global actions and transactions. Yet none of these instances seem to be what scholars have in mind when they describe finance as either abstract or as an abstraction. Rather, the abstract is employed as a trope that organizes and structures, but that itself eludes representation and definition. Abstract abstraction instead appears as a kind of strange amalgam, a quilting point. For example, in an article tracking precisely the representation of finance over several centuries, the British literary critic Paul Christwhite and his authors begin with the assumption that, quote, the financial marketplace has played an integral role in the development of capitalism and is often perceived as elusive and mysterious since it deals primarily in abstractions, end of quote. While this quotation has the benefit of interrogating the abstract, it also reveals that in the author's conception, finance is already assumed to have an essentially abstract character. The anthropologist Caitlin Zaloom positions this abstract character a bit differently. She writes that, quote, fashioning a social narrative for abstract information helps traders create understandings of market fluctuations. So here she's talking about how traders have to deal in abstractions on a daily basis. The literary critic Alison Schonkweiler, in her own work on the representation of finance, assumes a, quote, idea of capitalism as increasingly abstract, limitless, and virtual, end quote. To specify how certain economic forms participate in the discourse of abstraction, we must turn to Marxist theory. It is within Marxism that abstraction serves as a conduit and hindrance to economic knowledge. And it is there that the term has been most theorized and differentiated. In both its critical theoretical and political economic tradition, Marxist abstraction maintains a specificity and a certain critical poise. Within this discourse, we can delimit different kinds of abstraction that finance might be said to participate in or to reconfigure, including Marx's and subsequently Alfred Sonrethel's real abstraction. Dick Bryan, the Australian political economist, has a term called a lived abstraction. Frederick Jameson talks of finance as a, quote, second-order abstraction. And Postone argues that capitalism accesses a, quote, abstract dimension of value, end quote. Jameson, the literary critic, has furthermore said, and this is in his reading of Giovanni Origi's book, The Long 20th Century, that we need a, quote, new account of abstraction, end quote, to understand our financialized presence. Is that true? Is finance abstract, or has our definition of abstraction changed during a financial era? These are different questions. And we have to do more than simply move from the abstract to the concrete through finance. We must be able to reverse the project too. We must be able to say, how does the mediation of finance in culture change not only finance, but change culture as well? This needs to be a sort of dichotomous pairing. Then we must ask, how and when did finance become abstract? It certainly wasn't for Marx, and indeed in the early 20th century, throughout sort of American novels, American naturalist novels, including something like The Pit or The Octopus or the aptly named Financier, Theodore Dreiser's 1908 novel, finance was ascertained to be absolutely concrete. It was seen, it was represented, it was uncomplicated, it was usually criminal. So this is a sort of massive change. While abstraction rarely provides a method when it's deployed in contemporary critiques of problems, contemporary critiques of finance, it was a methodological problem for Marx, who repeatedly sought to categorize what makes the concrete concrete, what makes the abstract abstract, and on which of these levels any investigation should begin. The stakes are beguiling in their simplicity. If we begin with too abstract a concept to orient our investigation, we preclude access to the quotidian, material, and indeed perceptible world. And if we begin with too concrete a term, then we may be unable to understand its organization and imbrication within a larger social totality. For Marx, the concrete is a metabolized result of the abstract and concrete. He writes, quote, "The concrete concept is concrete because it is a synthesis of many definitions, thus representing the unity of diverse aspects. It appears, therefore, in reasoning as a summing up, a result, and not a starting point," end quote. Conversely, and again this is Marx, he writes, quote, "As a rule, the most general abstractions arise only in the midst of the richest possible concrete development, where one thing appears as common to all," end quote. So in my work on finance, one of the things I've really tried to do is engage it in a matter that's both concrete and abstract simultaneously. To claim that finance is abstract without showing its concrete dimension may in fact produce the kind of misrepresentations that so many critics of finance are attempting to ameliorate. And yet to reduce finance to a series of techniques and transactions, and this is really the project of much, I think, of the social studies of finance, without locating its abstract dimension, likewise circumscribes the investigation. So in my book, as you can hopefully see from the title, Scandals and Abstraction, I tried to bring these two together. And you'll note that abstraction is singular, and there's a reason for that, although when many people write about the book, they usually mistakenly add an S to it, which I think is interesting. And I just want to give one sort of example of where we might see this in American cultural discourse. This is a chart that I made for an art opening that I curated in 2012 called To Have and To Owe. And it was a show about art in debt, art and debt, art in debt. And working with some artists, some graphic designers, we took the phrase complex deal and we tried to map how since 1980 that phrase had appeared in English language publications globally. These are both financial publications, but also popular publications. And one of the things that you'll notice if you read American political discourse is that whenever there's a crisis, finance is described as complex. Whenever there's not a crisis, it's described as quite simple. Everyone should do it. Anyone should do it, right? And so what this chart shows is that the first time the phrase really gets used is in 1985 during the savings and loans crisis, which is sort of a series of banking scandals that happens in Texas, but with which a lot of American politicians were involved. And then the phrase sort of slowly works its way into American vernacular. And then at 2001 with the Enron failure, this is the sort of introduction of derivatives into American popular discourse. It returns again, the idea that the reason that Enron failed was that derivatives were so complex that no one could understand them. Now, one of the things that the yellow indicates here is the percentage of Americans that are invested in the stock market. So more and more Americans are encouraged to be invested in the stock market. Indeed, if you have a retirement plan, you have to be invested in the stock market. And this period here throughout, 1995 up until 2004, 2005, that's when E-Trade is running these ads on television showing like a child or an animal operating a stock brokerage account, because the idea is it's so easy to do that if you haven't become a financier yet, there's something wrong with you. And then during the global financial crisis, it reaches a peak, right? The idea that the reason that the subprime crisis emerged, the reason that the credit crisis became a global crisis was because finance was so complex that no one could understand it. And then it's almost completely receded from cultural discourse, but maybe it will be back in 2 years. We don't know. And one of the really interesting things about this is it's a discourse that happens on both the right and left. It's a sort of apolitical discourse in the sense. And I just want to show one clip. Are people familiar with the filmmaker Michael Moore? Yeah, okay. He's, I think, the closest thing we have to a progressive filmmaker who's somewhat popular in the US. So this is his critique of the financial crisis. It's called Capitalism, a Love Story. It came out in 2011. And I'm just going to show a clip. He interviews a derivatives trader to try to find out what derivatives are. And again, this is a critique of finance, or that's how he explains it. Can people hear it? No.
The volume's on the. see how well that is now.
Other schools working on it. Actually, every day they work, they make the world worse. So what exactly were the top students from Harvard and other schools working on these days? Derivative. Credit default swaps.
I can't make any sense out of this. I might as well quit.
That's exactly how I felt when I started hearing these new terms. So I went down to the New York Stock Exchange to get some answers.
Sir, can you explain derivatives to me? Anybody explain derivatives, credit default swaps? Can somebody explain to me what these are? Sir, can you tell me what a credit default swap is? Can you explain a derivative to me? Can you tell me what a derivative is? What are we talking about? I can see that. Hey, I'm looking for some advice. You guys got any advice for me here? Credit default swap? Oh.
I did find one guy on Wall Street who wasn't a film critic. Marcus Hawk is an Ivy League educated engineer who was a vice president of Lehman Brothers and spent 15 years on Wall Street creating what they call complex financial instruments.
What is a derivative?
Well, derivative is really, it's a secondary bet on an underlying product. So you might have a stock and you have an option on that stock. And an option on the stock allows you the privilege, but not the obligation, to buy or sell. How should I put this? You're allowed to make a decision of whether or not you want to ultimately take that exposure. Let me explain it another way. So the derivatives price is based on the price of something else. So it's kind of like a second degree equation. If you think of, let's say, maybe I should go back. I'm going to start this over again. Let's go back here.
I was lost. Maybe there's someone at Harvard University who could explain it to me.
The buyer, so the seller owns the loan and invites default, and they sell off somebody else. Sorry, let me just back up. I apologize. These are pretty exotic.
Derivatives are nothing more than.
Here we go. He goes on to explain how they're so complex that they can't understand it. That's actually.
Can I just say that's the author of?
Yeah, that's the author of This Time is Different. Yeah, absolutely. And obviously he knows what a derivative is. I mean, this is Michael Moore's presentation. Okay, so this is sort of how I try to think about finance and the representation between abstract and concrete when it's mediated in culture. And my second project, the one that I just completed, is quite different in the sense that I tried to, as opposed to thinking about finance as something which is overly abstract and requires a reduction, I tried to think about the flip side of the coin. So I tried to think about making labor more complex, making labor a sort of more mediated term. As the title, Wages Against Artwork, suggests, I'm looking at contemporary artwork, and the term I use here is what I call decommodified labor. So you can see in the subtitle, Decommodified Labor and the Rise of Socially Engaged Art. So socially engaged art, I'm sure many of you know what it is. It's sort of art that aims to make a useful social intervention, maybe by building a school, or even there's one in Portland that's a roving medical clinic that provides dentistry, but does so as the artwork. It's the intervention constitutes the artwork. And then secondly, in this project, I really tried to think through what I called decommodified labor, which first appeared to me as the simple fact of 40 years plus of stagnant wages in the United States. So most simply, what I mean by decommodified labor is formal labor that's not recompensed, that's not paid, that has no wage. As with any aesthetic, economical, historical, which is to say cultural concept, decommodified labor is indexable but not reducible to an empirical reality. We have multiple and discrete data points to guide us. First, there has essentially been no real wage increase in the United States since 1972. We know that from decades of sociological research, and we also know that employment has become more service-oriented, low wage, and precarious. But at a certain level, that bad work of precarity also becomes no work, the inability to work. So I've been really motivated by the economic historian Aaron Benenov, who notes that, quote, in high-income countries by 2010, more than 1 in 6 workers and 1 in 4 young workers counted as surplus to labor demands. But a concept, of course, cannot be produced by data alone. Facts must be distilled within a historical scheme in which their importance as fact and the hierarchical terrain of their empiricism must seed into an abstract concept. Thus, decommodified labor can not only be lack of a wage, although it may first appear that way. So, methodologically, I tried to locate the construction of decommodified labor at multiple levels of abstraction as it moves between art and the economy. So it should be able to be thematized. Many of the artists I look at this book, that's how they would discuss their own work, as concerned with declining wages or no wages. It should redound with empirical specificity. So we note that a huge number of people in the United States now, and actually in high-income countries all over the world, either can't find work or do have formal work, but work that is unpaid. And then that empiricism should also resonate with the infrastructure of the commodity form, which itself is generative of what we mean when we talk about the aesthetic. So I tried to locate decommodified labor as it's both used to produce and represented in socially engaged art. Consequently, I used decommodified labor as a device to tell a story about the rise of this moment in art history as it develops from aspects of institutional critique, conceptual art, performance art, and community arts traditions. So let me just give you a few examples here. The sort of groupings that I looked at for decommodified labor include children in art as unpaid workers. This is an image from Tino Segal, uses a lot of children in his artwork. And the New York Times has published his pay rates. He doesn't pay anything for children under 12. This is a Karsten Holler. This was a few years ago at the Tate, I believe. He constructed a playground as the artwork, and then children would just come and play. And then another trend that I've noticed is the use of animals as artists or as art workers in art. This is a chimpanzee taking and selling photographs in Red Square. It's by the Russian conceptual artist Komar Melamed. This is a Yanis Kounelis restaging of 12 Live Horses that happened a few years ago in New York City. And then this is another Komar Melamed, an elephant painting camp in Thailand. And then this is, I just enjoy this. This is an American reality TV show about dogs with jobs, which is sort of wonderful. Because so many people can't get jobs, but dogs can. So the reason I'm interested in this is because it's essentially impossible to pay a pigeon or a horse or an elephant or a toddler. And so my claim is that as this kind of representation proliferates in art, one of the things that artists are doing is making a critique of the unpaid labor of the artist, him or herself, through the engagement with the animal or the children. So what's important for me in this project is that each iteration of decommodified labor functions without reliance on a wage. Animals were for centuries considered crucial workers in multiple industries, and indeed it was only with the rise of a broad-based wage system that animals were disbarred from such work. Children, too, have long been important economic agents, and only recently were they stripped of that status, and only in the global north. That those members of our social world who were once workers now appear in artwork as artwork without payment is an important my argument. So I try to base decommodified labor as a site to translate between theories of labor and capital, art production and art criticism. And I believe that it might be the missing term in contemporary discussions about art and value, as those conversations relate to socially engaged art. When, for example, Shannon Jackson claims in her book, Social Works on Social Practice Art, that socially engaged art organizes itself around, quote, a de-autonomized aesthetic, end quote, I would add that such art probably is being produced by decommodified labor, which I think more often than not produces that kind of aesthetic. So I use decommodified labor as both an object of analysis and as a site for interpretations. It's a dialectical process that may be located at the level of capitalist production in daily life, but also, crucially, that's represented in culture, that produces culture. Decommodified labor provides for me a material and conceptual site to investigate how the shifting composition of value and the structure of surplus appropriation finds a potentially critical form in art production. And one of the things that I think is so crucial at the level of method is to maintain a certain categorical specificity. So in this project, I try to endorse Stuart Martin's contention that, quote, institutional theories of art and the art world have so far been developed at a level of generality that fails to register the specificity of capitalist forms, end quote. I suggest that the pervasive decommodification of cultural labor today may be interpreted as one response to what various critics have understood as the late 20th century shifting composition of value, whether that moment is diagnosed as the ends of the Keynesian compact, the rise of financialization, or the neoliberalization of the state. And I'm going to provide a sort of example of some of the artwork that I deal with here. But before I do, I just want to say that, again, the methodological point about the discourse of abstraction is crucial here. And too often, I think, in criticism about the relationship between aesthetics and the economy, abstraction gets deployed as an entity to mediate the difference between the two realms. One hears how the economy is abstract, and one is told how certain non-figurative media are abstract. And then these two abstractions become a sort of site of metaphorical translation. So I suggest that we need to avoid this metaphorical approach and again maintain a kind of categorical specificity that can register both abstract and concrete simultaneously. Okay, so now I want to provide an example of one socially engaged artwork that I write about in the book that really engages with the presence of live animals. And of course, that's not new. Performance art has been doing that, and institutional art has been doing that since the 1970s. Richard Serra, for example, explained in 1970, quote, once you find that you're not using paint for its illusionistic qualities or color refraction, you can use any material as equally relevant, including live and stuffed animals. In today's art and animals, I want to suggest the artist, the animal has become an art worker. So the artist has ceased to be paid, and the animal has become a site of labor engagement. So for example, Steve Baker in his book Animal Aesthetics write that animals are, quote, complex artistic collaborators, end quote. Brian Masumi calls animals, quote, creative agents, end quote. Ron Broglio claims that animals, quote, form alliances with artists, end quote. And Lisa Jean Moore writes that bees are, quote, being turned into performance artists and sculptors, end quote. So I want to suggest that the presence of live animals and its theorization by critics can help us understand the relationship between unwaged work and artwork, between commodities, finance, and aesthetics. Of course, we already do have a robust aesthetics of animality, and I'm thinking of Derrida, of Deleuze, of Agamben. Deleuze says most simply that, quote, art begins with the animal, end quote. My concern with these post-structuralist accounts of animals' aesthetics is that, crucially, they short-circuit labor. In the past 30 years, animals have transitioned from a material used by artists into a site for the artistic representation of decommodified labor. So let me take seriously Donna Haraway's question a question that she herself does not answer but asks, and that is, quote, where is our zoological Marx when we need him? Okay, let me just show a clip from 2013 artwork called Trading with the Enemy by Duke Riley. And of course, in the United States, Cuba is considered an active enemy of the state. So that's the title, Trading with the Enemy here. Let me just show this clip. Installation view of the piece. This is where you saw the pigeons land when they returned to Key West. So Duke Riley's Trading with the Enemy requires skilled training and execution from both the artist and the pigeons themselves. Riley equipped a group of homing pigeons, some with customized cigar holders and others with customized video cameras, and set them on course from Havana, Cuba to Key West, Florida. Half the birds transported the famous and contraband. In the United States, Cuban cigars are contraband. So the birds were transporting them on their body, and the other half documented the journey. The moving visual abstraction and figuration is in the pigeons' documentary footage of their flight is notable as Cuba's rooftops give way to the monochrome blue-gray of sky and ocean, only to diversify into color and shapes again as the pigeons land back in Key West. And you don't see this here, but in the gallery, one pigeon actually takes a detour and lands on a chartered fishing vessel and is just sort of surveying the conversation below. And the people on the vessel notice the pigeon and notice that it's wearing something. And one of them says, it's got a bomb on it, right? And then, the pigeon just stays there for a while and then flies away. When this is shown in the gallery, the different pigeons footage loops simultaneously, and the pigeons themselves sit in this coop that Riley made. Okay, so the argument that I want to give is that Riley's piece gives us an example of decommodified labor in two different dimensions. First, in its use of animal work as the piece's subtending material. The pigeon's work is the backbone of the piece and will ultimately, I want to suggest, become self-reflexive. Yet the piece's resonance is structured by the fact that birds are not recognized as workers, and that non-recognition becomes efficacious. The impossibility of the pigeon's labor enables an allegory to emerge from their work about artists' work and about the contemporary production of artwork. And second, of course, the pigeon's work is the object of representation. It's what we see in the video, what we see in the gallery, and what we hear. Pigeons, of course, cannot labor. They do not sell their wages, so they can't be said to be laborers in any meaningful sense. But they do work, and I want to show how that becomes a representational possibility. So already one could counter that physical exertion is not reducible to work, and that physical exertion is not reducible to artistic materiality. So when is something work, when is it labor, and when is it perhaps animacy, to use Mel Chen's incisive phrase, or technology, to use Donna Haraway's? More complicated still, when is an activity labor or work, even though it doesn't make a claim on valorization? So what I want to show is that the pigeons are working, and then somewhat counterintuitively, I want to show that the effect in the film is that their work is challenged, and that it's subsumed into a decommodified register. So we can begin by simply locating the many labors that compose this piece. Cuba is an enemy, again to the US, but what that means in economic terms is hardly straightforward. For 60 years or so, Cuba was the great site of American-based Caribbean economic crime. It was the central haven, out of the country but in the same time zone, as the saying goes, for American capital flight and money laundering along the eastern seaboard. When Cuba ceased to host American money laundering through its radical socialization of land and labor, it became an economic enemy. Riley could be quoting this history in Trading with the Enemy, and the piece must be said to contain socialist labor too, for the birds left from Havana. During a speech announcing the plan of the revolution in 1961, pigeons did famously land on Fidel Castro's shoulder. So here's Fidel giving the speech in which he announces that it will be a socialist revolution, and pigeons come and sit on his shoulder during the talk. This is a very famous image in Cuban folklore. And in fact, the Cuban social practice artist Tania Bruguera has herself restaged this piece in which she plays Fidel Castro and has pigeons land on her shoulder. So Riley could simply be sort of quoting these kind of artistic enactments using the pigeons. But whether it's the illicit movement of commodities, money, or people, if we focus on the trade, then the reenactment that Riley is staging must be deemed ironic, since the movement of goods between the United States and Cuba has been and still is illegal, and since those who engage in illegal activities don't usually tend to document and publicize it. So the immediate irony is going to become the piece's visibility of the illegality and the fact that Riley uses that illegality to produce his performance documentation. The more structuring irony, I want to argue, is that it's the pigeons that are doing the recording and the pigeons who are conducting the trade. Pigeons cannot be prosecuted for violating the embargo, but they cannot also, in any semantically consistent way, be beneficiaries of the fruits of their labor. Pigeons cannot receive a wage. So we know that the pigeons' actions will be disavowed. Disavowed as causal, disavowed as criminal, disavowed as economic. And indeed, the New York Times did a special piece on Riley's work and called the Treasury Department, which is what manages the embargo with Cuba, to explain that quote. 11 homing pigeons have flown from Havana to Key West. Some have arrived with Cuban cigars strapped to their bellies, end quote. And the response from the federal government was okay, spelled phonetically in the pages of the New York Times. Like, what are they going to do to the pigeons, right? So the pigeons' actions are discounted as economic and instead understood to be purposeless, a hallmark of the aesthetic. And indeed, even during the height of the embargo, artists, and more importantly, art and art materials, were not subject to trade limitations. But does the disavow of the pigeons as economic agents result from the fact that they are not really workers or that they are really artists? The model for flagrantly violating the law and not being prosecuted for it is, of course, an artistic one. And we can all think of many artistic works that have this as its sort of basis. The pigeon performers in Riley's piece are given much latitude, but they're also unpaid. And the unpayment that gives them the economic latitude to violate the embargo is now deeply entrenched in American visual arts culture, where 71% of artists are not compensated for their shows, and where the collective BFA, MFA, PhD reports that only 8% of art graduates make a living off of their art. So what we're faced with in Riley's piece is animals conducting artistic work, representing artistic labor, and both of these being progressively disavowed as the piece circulates. Labor doesn't count as labor when artists are doing it. Work doesn't count as labor when animals are doing it. Trades don't count as trades when they're done with illicit goods. They're not represented in GDP, nor are they aggregated. I think we can read Riley's, I think we can read Riley's piece as producing an aesthetic exchange whereby labor cannot be evaluated or remunerated on numerous levels. What is the price of cigar smuggling? How does one pay a pigeon? When does a trade become a transaction? Thus, we've been falsely led into the reductio ad absurdum claim that pigeons must be artists. Okay, thank you very much.
So we have a couple of minutes for questions or for comments. Then we will open the floor a little later also for after all the presentations. Anybody want to have a question or a clarification? There are so many different angles we could take for this.
Okay.
You want to stay with the pigeons? Yes, Robert, please use the mic.
You want us to stay with the pigeons?
No. Go anywhere you want.
That was me.
No, well, I can stay with the pigeons for a minute, because one of my questions has to do with the fact that they are indeed homing pigeons, right? So they can return to Cuba, they can reveal the human trainers / art producers who are involved in this. They're not anonymous pigeons. They are agents of other art creators.
Yeah.
You want to comment on that?
I guess I don't understand what I don't see the significance.
Well, what I meant was you were saying that they are the artists and they are unpaid and they are unfound. No, you didn't say that.
No, they arrive back. Oh yeah, they absolutely arrive back and are traceable to Riley. Yeah, absolutely. So I say that they're representing this. They're representing being unpaid. I don't see them themselves as artists, but that's how they have been discussed. Yeah.
So, thank you very much for this presentation.
You're welcome.
So I'm an economic historian,
Wonderful.
and I just wanted to know a bit about the way you use the concept decommodified labor in this instance. You know, to me that's, I wouldn't say that it's labor that's not paid, but I would think about the processes of decommodification in the terms of Carl Polanyi or something like that.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to know where you lie in the...
Absolutely. It's very interesting. I think that the way I try to position it is looking at Polanyi and also Gösta Epsing Anderson and even more contemporary uses on the left today in American political discourse. The idea of decommodification functions as a kind of salve or a kind of limit that can be placed on certain market activities. So whether it's a historical trend in Polanyi of certain things being commodified and then decommodified and recommodified again, or whether it's a sort of political or state organization, like Gösta Epsing Anderson would imply that certain things are taken out of the labor market. What I try to do is sort of invert that concept. So I don't necessarily mean decommodified labor simply means it's unpaid. What I try to say is it functions as formal labor, and it actually represents an intensification of labor, right? In that it is unpaid. And I position this in the larger project. What I say is, it seems to me that there's sort of two contemporary accounts of labor in economic genealogies. One is the Marxist idea of the real subsumption of labor to capital, in which there's this ongoing intensification. And then the other is the sort of neoliberal claim of there is no labor anymore, there's only human capital. We all have these sort of assets to sell, and now we have to to sell them. And so to me, what I try to do with decommodified labor is I try to say it borrows from both of these, right? One has to sell certain parts of oneself, and it's a formal exchange, except for there's no wage in return. So there's nothing emancipatory about it at all, right? And it tries to engage a little bit with the idea of an intensification of the labor process. But at the same time, I think in economic history, it's always a risky claim to say something is more intense, something is more abstract, something is more complex. So I say that decommodified labor comes and goes. Certain things, I mean, children were for centuries laborers. Their labor has largely now been decommodified. Could it be commodified again? Yes, absolutely. Does it function like that now? No, not really. But if you'd like to talk about it more, I have a long article that I can refer you to. No? Okay.
Would you say that the pigeons are like slaves?
No.
No?
No.
They are fed, aren't they?
Yeah, he actually, that artist lived in a pigeon coop for 4 years to train those birds.
The slave owner.
No, I would not say that.
So the last comment.
Yeah, hi, my name is Eric. Thank you for a really inspiring presentation.
Thank you.
I would like to sort of turn the mirror around a bit here. And so isn't it a convention with sort of relational aesthetics and socially engaged art that everyone who enters into the piece sort of isn't paid, but actually part of the piece? That sort of, when you take part in an installation as a sort of
viewer,
spectator,
yeah.
Subject, material, whatever,
yeah.
You're not paid. And following down that line, isn't there a sort of a commodification that the artist does by drawing everyone into the piece, so to speak? And what happens if to use your term of commodification, when we turn the issue around like that?
Well, yeah, absolutely true. I think it's true that in contemporary arts production, most people, whether it's the artists, the spectators, the monkey or the animals, the interns, most people are unpaid. I think that's absolutely true. Does the artwork then become commodified? Is it still commodified in the classic sense?
Is the artist commodifying?
Right, or is the artist commodifying? Right, absolutely. I think what's interesting about decommodified labor in the case of American socially engaged art is that much of the socially engaged art, the message, the claim of social efficaciousness is a form of economic emancipation. That's the idea, right? So for instance, in the larger project, I look at students look at the rise of art schools and the transition in the US from artists as a category of people who might be paid, might be supported by government grants, to those who might have to take out loans. So there's that economic history. What I think is so interesting in the case of this kind of socially engaged art is that now we notice decommodified labor as both the historical scene, it's being thematized, it's being formalized, right? It becomes a sort of cohesive organization of the production of this kind of art. So I guess to your question isn't it the case that it's all unpaid, or all somewhat unpaid if we look at installation, performance art? Yes, but this would be a claim of where does that come from and why does it emerge in this aesthetic way now? How does it circulate as such?
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay.
In the Netherlands. And you will speak to us on the Black Box City, Spectres of Finance, please.
Thank you very much for the introduction. First of all, I would like to thank Erling for inviting me here. I'm very happy to be here, present my work, get some feedback on my work. Works better? So what I was saying is that I'm very happy to be here, very thankful to have been invited, and look forward also to your ideas on what I will present today. I also have a very fancy micro. I could almost dance with that today. So that's good, because I tend to also go a bit lower. Let me know if that happens. Okay, so my presentation today is about a metaphor that is very often used in order to describe contemporary finance. And that's the metaphor of the black box. I'm not sure if everyone in this room is familiar with this idea of the black box. In general, the metaphor of the black box, and that's not just in finance, is used in order to refer to phenomena that have a verifiable input and output. However, the process that turns input into output is unknown or a little bit opaque. So metaphorically, this transforming process is enclosed in a black box. Contemporary critical discourses of finance also refer to the concept of the black box. They use it to indicate that the things happening on today's financial markets are largely unknown or invisible for the public. And by public, I kind of mean everyone who is not actively involved in financial trading. Passively, we're kind of all involved in it nowadays. So the idea here is that the public only witnesses the results of financial trading, such as, for instance, the financial crash of 2008, but doesn't really see or understand how these results came about. So I mentioned critical discourses of finance, but what do I really mean by that? On the one hand, I mean scientific and maybe sort of how scientific have popular publications about finance. In particular, the concept is very, very often used in science and technology studies of finance, which use it to refer to the under-researched social and technological processes and infrastructures that underpin contemporary finance. And publications in that field often promise to open the black box, break into the black box, move inside the black box, unpack the black box, and to kind of explore what is inside of it. On the other hand, the black box metaphor is also sometimes used in popular cultural narratives dealing with finance. Narratives which seek to explain contemporary financial trading to a broader audience of, let's say, non-experts. Popular visual cultures of finance will be my focus of today. And the first example that I would like to discuss with you is a film called Money and Speed, Inside the Black Box. There we have it. Money and Speed is an originally Dutch documentary about high-frequency trading, which was broadcasted by the Dutch TV program Bipro Tegenlicht in 2011. However, the film is in English, and it has become known internationally, and it has been circulated via platforms such as YouTube, DokuBase. You can find it on websites that are trying to give recommendations about documentaries about finance. The director is Miriam. Does everyone in this room know more or less what high-frequency trading is? Maybe I give a very brief definition. So high-frequency trading describes a form of financial trading that uses computers in order to transact large numbers of orders, often at fractions of a second. And the interesting thing is it uses algorithms in order to analyze markets and react to certain market conditions. And timing plays a very important role in that context. So I'd like to start by showing you the opening scene of this film, and I will show you about 4 minutes of that. So, here we go.
Is your agency using WordPress to build websites? That's like carving a chicken with a handsaw, drying your hair with a leaf blower, or using a baseball bat to kill a housefly. They get the job done, but they're awful to work with, kinda like WordPress. Instead, work with Duda, a website platform that's designed to help agencies build websites at scale. So stop working with the wrong tools instead.
Just need to find you also got a bit of free advertising here.
On May the 6th, 2010, at 1400 hours, 42 minutes and 44 seconds, the US stock markets go into free fall. Dow Jones takes the fastest and most dramatic nosedive in its history, an event that will be remembered as the flash crash.
Where are you on May 6, 2010?
Here working. May 6, 2010. Yes, I was here.
I spent all day, literally locked away on holiday, looking at the British general election.
1053, so 90 handles? That's too much. That's way too much.
I was on a conference call with a potential investor, one eye on the market, one eye on my own profits and losses, and then my ears and mouth doing whatever else they have to do. And the market basically looks like it's going to go to hell that day.
It was the first really down day that we had in a while. And I remarked today, let's just stay on top of this because this could get really ugly.
So 40 minutes in, we're in the middle of a great conversation, and he says, look, I gotta go. We'll talk again. This was really interesting, but I have to go now. And I watched the market fall another, 2 or 3% from there.
It wasn't just minutes later. It was Armageddon.
Here you go. I've told it's 835. The Dow ticker. Wow, almost 1,000 points. We call this a capitulation.
I was just opening up my computer, like most everybody, and going, oh my God.
I'm shouting to my colleagues, because I have a giant TV in my office, gawking at the screen. Like when the Dow hit nearly down 1,000 points, you're like, really?
87 in dark trading, 60 in dark trading, 85 in dark trading, and I got all the way down.
And people didn't know why it was happening. And there was rumor after rumor after rumor, and it kept on getting worse.
I saw that panic, and then I started watching CNN or one of those channels.
What we're seeing right now, I mean, I believe maybe unprecedented. You're going to talk about capitulation. Let's take a look at P&G.
They're going to probably halt trading. We can't stop the selling.
I don't think I found out about this in real time, so this was probably a half an hour later or an hour later. There's nothing that one can do in the middle of the day, so there's no button that we press that says, hey, stop what's going on, so the markets are going to move the way that the markets move.
It just didn't fit the facts that there was some big global news story. It looked more like an error or a bad price. That's what it looked more like at first.
And then it got magically better. And nobody had seen a recovery that quick either.
It was a little bit like seeing someone hit by a car, or you see some terrible motorcycle accident, the guy must totally be dead, and then the person gets up and walks away.
The market didn't work. It broke down. The machines broke down. That's what happened. Procter was never at 47.
That to me is the mystery. I think it really, we don't understand these things.
That's what I wanted to show you. There will be some more coming later. Good. So the whole documentary, as you probably saw, focuses on the so-called flash crash of 2010 and applying a style of investigative journalism promises to take viewers inside of the black box of high-frequency trading that brought about this speed crash. What I find very interesting is that the documentary establishes the scene using a high-angle perspective on Wall Street's corporate architecture, which it combines with a rhetoric of market plunge, free fall, it mentions, as if we were to fall from those skyscrapers. The idea here is The buildings kind of symbolize the financial market, including its ups and downs, rises and falls, and as such, they also symbolize the black box that the documentary promises to expose. Yet, what happens next, and here my critical argument starts a bit, what happens next is in fact not a breaking into the black box of automated trading, but rather a reinforcement of the mystery that surrounds this black box. In the next scene, the film shows expert interviews with supposed insiders of the black box, insiders of finance, such as a trader, a quantitative analyst, a historian of technology, another professor. And what one would maybe expect is that those insiders tell viewers what in fact happened on May the 6th, 2010. But that's not really what they do. Instead, these experts underline that they were equally surprised by what happened on that day. They say things like, and then it got magically better, or to me this is all a mystery, we don't understand those things. And emphasizing the rhetoric of mystery, there is music in the background that might remind us a bit of the X-Files. So my first observation is that most parts of the documentary indeed do not break into the black box of high-frequency trading, but rather foment its black box status. My second argument is that the urban imaginary plays a particular role in this process. Now, before I go on, I need to define what I mean by urban imaginary. The urban theorist and geographer Edward Soja has defined urban imaginaries as our mental and cognitive mappings of urban reality and the interpretative grids through which we think about, experience, evaluate and decide to act in the places, spaces and communities in which we live. Urban imaginaries may be generated through our own first-hand experience of cities, of living in cities, but they might also derive from literature, film, photography, video games, mobile apps, augmented reality, and the list goes on. What I like about Soja's definition of urban imaginaries is that it shows how our ideas of cities influence our behavior in cities. So, for example, if we imagine a certain city to be dangerous, we will behave more cautious there than, for example, around the corner here in Gothenburg, which I don't imagine as very dangerous. Maybe I'm wrong. Popular cultural narratives of finance tend to make frequent use of urban imaginaries. The research I'm presenting today is part of a bigger research project about urban imaginaries and financial crisis narratives. And in these narratives, we find imaginaries such as this one from the film, blockbuster film Wall Street, Money Never Sleeps, or this title of a German news magazine about the most dangerous corporation in the world at that time, according to Der Spiegel, or this imaginary about the foreclosure crisis. Back to the black box. From the beginning, in its opening scene, the film Money and Speed visually associates financial markets with buildings. One might even claim that the skyscrapers that are shown in the opening scene embody the black boxes of high-frequency trading because of their rectangular shape and because they are the impenetrable head locations of certain financial businesses. And the public cannot enter them most of the time, nor see inside, so they have a bit of a black box feel. This association between city and finance also happens in Meermann's subsequent documentary, which is entitled The Wall Street Code. So that will be my next example. Together with another documentary entitled Quants, the Alchemists of Wall Street, which I won't discuss today, Money and Speed and The Wall Street Code form a trilogy broadcasted between 2011 and 2013. So in the not immediate, but sort of still kind of aftermath of the global financial crisis. The Wall Street Code also uses a vocabulary of mystery. The documentary promises to follow the quant, Chaim Bodek, on his crusade against Wall Street and its code of secrecy and complexity. Here the complexity comes back. And this is how the crusade starts. have the link embedded here.
Wait, can you look at this? Does this sound like me?
Super quick computers and advanced mathematic formulas have largely taken over trading on the financial markets from human beings. Algorithms, which seem to have a life of their own. Algorithms secretly lie waiting for the moment that your Apple share or your pension money gets on the market. The only ones who understand this system in any way are its architects, the algorithm developers. Chaim Bodek is one such algo developer. After finding some strange wrongdoings, he sets out on a personal crusade against this elusive system. It's a step that goes directly against the unwritten Wall Street code of silence and secrecy. This is what's in store for you.
There's kind of a rule, never blame other people, never blame the market.
So, similar to money and speed, the Wall Street Code associates the city with the invisible dynamics of algorithmic trading. Here, in this image, for instance, it looks as if the digital data streams that the documentary talks about were moving to the city, insofar as the silhouette in the background kind of resembles a skyline, and the super quick data streams move towards the silhouette, gathering on top of it a bit like an undefined flying object. The impression created is that financial cities such as New York or Chicago are the places where algorithmic trading takes place, and yet they are also the surfaces, the impenetrable black boxes that conceal algorithmic finance. Financial trading can be localized at these cities, but what happens within these cities in terms of financial market interaction remains invisible and unintelligible. Something is happening in and in between global financial cities, but we cannot really verify it. So the city is thus portrayed in both documentaries as a black box, and this imaginary of the black box city returns, if only elusively, at several moments in all of Mehrman's documentaries. Another moment that I find quite defining, during which the imaginary of the black box city is particularly evident, is when the films, and both documentaries do that at some point, promise to finally take the viewers to the heart of algorithmic trading. To do so, both films feature a scene in which the camera accompanies an export to a financial data center in the outskirts of a financial city. And in Money and Speed, this data center is located in New Jersey, next to the global financial city of New York. I would like to briefly show you that scene.
This is a big financial service firm here.
So no name on the door?
Nothing. You would never know what's going on here. As you notice, it's guarded, gated. There's cameras everywhere. They probably know that we're here right now. So in a period of time, they would come out and say, "What are you doing? Stop doing that," type of thing. And if you rolled up and said, "I'd like to come in," they would not let you in.
Jeff Hipsman, once employed by Wall Street investment bank Lehman Brothers, now works as a data center broker for the world's leading financial companies.
And obviously, and also no signage, so you don't know whose facility this is, you don't know what's going on inside of it. Completely a nondescript building.
No windows?
No windows. If this building has a problem, if this building is damaged, if anything happens to this building, they run the risk of not being able to execute trades. So they protect this. This is the heart and the lifeblood of their business. So imagine your home where you have double everything, double power utility feed coming in, 2 refrigerators, 2 washing machines, 2 televisions, and if something were to break, you can go immediately to the second device. In the data center world, that's called a tier 4 facility. And what they need is 2 of everything, because the cost of downtime to these organizations, if they're not able to trade or they lose trading operations for seconds, it could cost them an enormous amount of money. Some of these firms take it to the next level where not only do they have it with a duplicate within a facility, then they have a second facility that's exactly the same. The goal of these facilities is to minimize, if not eliminate, any single point of failure. New Jersey is a very hot market for data centers because of the distance issue to Manhattan. When you're dealing in milliseconds, there can be absolutely no delay. Being that the technology has a limitation in terms of how far away it can be in terms of that latency, it's based on the speed of light between one point and another, that distance becomes your outside ring, your outside distance that you can go. It tends to be in the neighborhood of 30 to 35 fiber miles. So we're constantly tracking the fiber as to where it is and what the main routes are. And we also track where the power is, because another main component of these facilities is they are very heavy power users. They need an enormous amount of electrical capacity in order to operate. We don't want to have any outside event.
Okay, what interests me about this scene is how the rhetoric of the black box is reflected in the spaces that it shows. Via its narrative and aesthetic composition, the scene appears to elusively suggest that the data center is in fact the black box. This idea is mostly communicated via the filmic depiction of the data center building. The film first approaches the data center from the outside, but then it also shows different angles. So we have from the car, and then via different satellite images showing the urban black box of algorithmic trading from above and then zooming in more and more. So the film actually kind of plays on the analogy between the concept of the black box and the box-like architecture of this particular data center building. I'm not sure if every data center has this box-like shape, which is highlighted through the camera perspective on it. So now Roland Barthes, for instance, has once defined semiotic structures that play on this analogy between meaning and forms as a myth, and he understands a myth as a particular form of ideological speech. So according to Roland Barthes, we could maybe describe this scene as a myth, as a form of ideological speech. But why is that insight important? Ideology is a kind of big word to describe a simple scene in a documentary movie. But I'm hoping to show now why I think that this might still hold true. The film seems to imply that financial markets, in particular those market segments in which high-frequency trading is dominant or popular, such as, for instance, currency markets, are inscrutable, and therefore also unintelligible and uncontrollable, because they are physically sealed off from the public by an urban, or in this case, suburban black box. The black box is responsible for it. Moreover, the scenes appear to imply that if only it was possible to access those black box spaces and understand their technological characteristics, fiber miles, light speed, etc., etc., if only maybe the people managing this building would let us in, it would be possible to see and finally understand why an event such as the flash crash of May the 6th came about. And I would like to argue that in doing so, these urban black box imaginaries belie a problem that characterizes liberal markets in general. A problem that Michel Foucault, in his critique of neoliberal governmentality, has called the principle of invisibility. So many of you are probably familiar with this work of Foucault, which he develops in his lectures on biopolitics. In these lectures, Foucault questions the reasoning behind certain theories of governmentality that developed in the 18th century, and he shows how those theories develop very much in interdependence with ideologies of market liberalism. And to that end, Foucault also criticizes Adam Smith's very famous metaphor, which I think he only used once, of the invisible hand, so his famous metaphor of market efficiency. And Foucault argues, now there's a long quote, for there to be certainty of collective benefit, for it to be certain that the greatest good is attained for the greatest number of people, not only is it possible, but it is absolutely necessary that each actor be blind with regard to this totality, the totality of the market. Everyone must be uncertain with regard to the collective outcome of this positive collective outcome is really to be expected. Being in the dark and the blindness of all the economic agents are absolutely necessary. The collective good must not be an objective. It must be not be an objective because it cannot be calculated, at least not within an economic strategy. Here we are at the heart of the principle of invisibility. So Foucault's main critique here is that the ideology of market liberalism presupposes that liberal markets need to be inscrutable in order to function. Each market actor, including the government, needs to be blind to the totality of the market and the interactions that are constantly taking place there in order for this market to function and also serve the collective benefit of everyone. For Foucault, this insight was important because it showed how the principle of the invisible hand, the principle of invisibility, equals a kind of disqualification of governmental market regulation. For me, this insight is important because I wish to argue that the urban black box imaginaries that money and speed and also the Wall Street Code create distract from the fact that liberal markets as such are to some extent inscrutable, and that this invisibility of the totality of all market transactions is part of the liberal market game. Otherwise, the very idea of speculation, of taking a bet on the market wouldn't really make sense if we always had a complete overview. So whether about 70 million liberal market subjects interact with each other in a national economy such as, for example, the Netherlands, or if international algorithms interact with each other on the global currency markets, the totality of these interactions is never retraceable completely. It's always to some extent inscrutable. However, the films ascribe this not to the principle of invisibility, characterizing liberal markets, but they ascribe this invisibility to the spatial and technological characteristics, to the black box characteristics of contemporary financial markets. These characteristics might amplify the invisibility and uncontrollability of financial market interactions, and that's why it's of course very important to study them. But they are not necessarily at the heart of the issue. And therefore, like to interpret those urban black box scenarios as manifestations of a tendency that has described as the post-political tendency to impose a narrative which will not put the blame for the meltdown, or in this case the flash crash, onto the global capitalist system as such, but on its secondary accidental deviations, too lax tax regulations, the corruption of big financial institutions, and so on and so on. In this case, the secondary accidental deviation would be the spatial and technological characteristics of financial markets, its urban black boxes. To sum this up, my main critique is that both films create urban black box imaginaries that draw attention away from the insight that liberal markets as such are inscrutable and supposed to be according to the current market logic. And in so doing, and that's maybe the bigger problem, they do not only establish a false causality, but they also distract from fundamental questions we might ask about the very system of liberal financial market exchange. So in other words, the focus on the black boxes of trading distracts from questions regarding the very order of our contemporary financial system, which in my view ought to be questions. Now, in this last part of the presentation, I'd like to present some more general reflections and also a few counterexamples. And for this I need a concept that is in the title of my talk, but that I have not yet talked about. And that's the concept of spectrality. So what the black boxes that I've mentioned so much today have in common is that they give an imaginary, an urban imaginary, to something that is somewhat difficult to imagine. Finance, for example, the simple difference of having or not having a certain number on our bank accounts certainly has a big influence in our lives. Therefore, finance is real. It has an impact. It's there, it's present. On the other hand, finance, in particular finance in our contemporary digital age maybe, is has some fictional qualities. It can take, for example, the form of a number on a bank account. The number would then represent a value that may or may not at some point be exchanged for a service or commodity, or for another representation of a value, such as another currency. I think Leigh is much better than I am in identifying the different degrees and forms of abstraction that might be involved in such a process. What interests me here is the simple fact that finance is real, but it also always implies some form of absence. So for example, if I have 100 kroner, am I pronouncing it correctly? In my hand, then these kroner are present, but they also imply an absence. What is absent is what I might exchange these kroner for in the future. Or if I lose 100 kroner on my bank account, let's say due to a bet, due to speculation, then I might see this difference in numbers. But what is not yet there, what is yet absent, is how this might affect our life. How I might not be able to pay for a certain bill or buy myself a new pair of shoes or something like that. That's still absent from the representation, but at the same time, the loss is already there. Within contemporary cultural theory, this quality of being present yet also absent, being in the present but also in the future, is often associated with the concept of spectrality. Maria del Pilar Blanco and Esther Perren have defined the figure of the spectre, the cultural figure of the spectre, as something that signifies precisely that which escaped full recognition and comprehension. So, the figure of the spectre, the spectral metaphor, describes liminal stages between visibility and invisibility, presence and absence, materiality and immateriality, reality and imagination, being in the present, yet also in the past or in the future. Spectre, for instance, often returns from the past into the present. Finance, we might say, is somewhat spectral. Financial transactions are present yet absent, real yet also somewhat imagined. They involve multiple temporalities. A credit, for instance, connects the present to the future. And they often, in particular, when we take into account all the financial instruments that were mentioned before in the Michael Moore documentary, for instance, they escape full recognition. So the argument on which I'd like to close this presentation is that it matters then how this spectrality of finance is represented in contemporary culture. The above described urban black box imaginaries of finance tend to misrepresent spectrality, the spectrality of financial markets, by ascribing it to the spatial and technological infrastructures of contemporary finance, to its urban black boxes. However, there are some counterexamples in contemporary narrative and visual culture. Often those examples are actually a bit less spectacular than the documentary that I just showed you. But I would like to maybe make the claim that I find them a bit more spectral. They basically give emphasis to the fact that finance is spectral by showing, for example, how the financial crisis can be present yet absent in the everyday urban public space of New York City or in London. The market crash is present because it's happening at the very moment this photo was shot, yet the people who are passing by those market ticker screens are not, or maybe not yet, affected by it. And that is much in contrast maybe to those whose houses were maybe evicted more or less at the same time at another faraway place. So that was present there. So admittedly, the images that I've just shown you do not politicize, do not explicitly politicize finance or financialization. They merely underline the spectral qualities of finance, its capacity to operate in ways that escape full recognition. However, what I find a bit more powerful about those images is that they imply that everyone may, at some point, or may not, be affected by the spectral workings of financialization, as was the case in 2008. It might be the case again in the future. So in contrast to those urban black box imaginaries that I've shown you before, they refrain from attributing the spectrality of finance to a false cause, but instead let it keep on haunting us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Miriam, we have 10 minutes or so for comments and questions. Please raise your hands, and not the same hands as last time. I'm waiting. Would you like to comment?
I love that question, but is there another one?
I remember you, Robert. I'll get back.
Thank you for that. I really enjoyed that. Just a quick question. Why does finance take on the role of suturing the visible and the invisible now?
Could you explain the word suturing?
Why does finance occupy that role? Why finance? I mean, you know, if you look at, for instance, images of industrial production in the 1920s or even 20s and 30s, something like Chaplin or something like Fritz Lang Metropolis, industry has a similar role. So is it just whatever the economic dominant is in a particular moment assumes that role, or is there something in your perspective that's unique about finance that would give it these characteristics that you've documented?
I hope that I understand you correctly. I think what you mean is that there are other forms in our contemporary economy that might also mediate between.
Yeah.
Yes, and I think I would probably agree with that and would say that this metaphor of spectrality could equally be applied to those. That's just, if we focus then on representations of finance, for instance, in the moment of a crisis, then it interests me to see how this quality is then represented. But I think we could probably apply similar forms of critique to those.
But it has something to do, doesn't it, Miriam? It has something to do with the urban space, as you see it. It's important for you that these places, these boxes, are situated in urban spaces, isn't it?
Yes, I'm following my narratives there. I think for me it's not necessarily that important. What I find is important to see is when you have a look at all those popular narratives of the financial crisis, is that those types of urban aesthetics, of which I've just shown a bit, are extremely prominent in those narratives and seem to somehow try to give a shape to the processes of finance.
Hi, thank you very much for the invitation. I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the urban black box narrative, particularly in relationship to the suburban or rural technological underpinnings via the data center and other things, because it seems like even in the film that you're critiquing, there's already this kind of, you know, I see your critique that it doesn't have windows. Like, what would we see? You just see banks of computers, right? But it seems like the kind of spectrality also has to do with the kind of virtual or technologization of the urban spaces in a way, right? And I wonder if you have any thoughts on how because I think that's Mahwah, New Jersey, where the data center is. I'm not positive. And there are other sites that are obviously much further away that are clearly in a kind of factory narrative. They're sort of the technological underpinning of these sites like Wall Street or London's financial district, right? So how do the sort of rural and suburban or ex-urban sites sort of prop up the mythological components of the urban black box.
Yes, okay, thank you. So I'm following, of course, the narratives, and in those narratives that I've seen, they seem to be returning those data centers. I'm actually not an expert of data centers, so I cannot even tell you if there are data centers which are further away even than those that were shown in the documentary. And I would very much, I think, agree with the thesis that they might amplify some of the dynamics we know of contemporary finance, of market transactions. I would just not, and that I think is my critique, see them at the heart of what is maybe spectral about those processes. And I find it quite interesting to see also, I'm not sure if you noticed, when the camera approaches this data center building, this person, this expert even says, okay, and now this is the heart and the lifeblood of it. And yeah, I think that's a bit where the narrative kind of goes wrong, in my view.
Yes, I was just wondering about the selection of the two films that you base this presentation on. Why, maybe you already mentioned this, but why did you pick them? And could you say something more about how representative they are for these kind of stories or narratives about finance?
Yes, of course I picked those for a reason, because this idea of the black box was maybe most explicit in those documentaries. One even has it in the title, the other one very much plays with it on a visual scale. What you see in other narratives of finance, visuals, is let's say slightly more elusive use of this idea of the black box. So often we also have, for instance, images that play a lot with this quality of impenetrability of buildings, and sort of, again, dealing with the mystery that surrounds those buildings. What I also often see are, for instance, do you know these mirrored glasses that a lot of corporate skyscrapers have? So really this idea, okay, here you stop, that you see a lot. And then, of course, the narrative that is being told about it is, again, okay, we are standing here in front and we would like to go in, but they don't let us. A bit as in the Michael Moore documentary as well, right? He's standing there and he's trying to get the expertise of the people coming out and trying to ask them, okay, can you please explain to me what is a credit default swap, what is a derivative? And they don't answer. And you kind of think, okay, but if only they would answer, then we would understand the crisis of 2008, but maybe that's not necessarily always the case.
It could have been any two films, really, but these were more like...
Those were really, really explicit about this idea of the black box, but I use this metaphor in order to refer to a broad range of narrative dealings with sort of impenetrable architectures. Yeah.
This question,
It's on.
this question, what I do? Yes? This question relates to that question. Are the arts, according to you, do you think that the arts are encouraging the imperial power of the financial world by accepting and showing us this exciting black box aesthetic that you're giving us? And thank you very much, it's fascinating. But it scares me, of course.
That's an interesting question. I would probably not accuse the arts in general for doing that. And that's also why I think, in a way, cultural analysis and critique can be very important, because I think some images can be very powerful in maybe even politicizing, or at least sort of drawing our attention to the fact that there are certain disconnects, that are certain things that we want to know more about, that there is maybe things that we might question about contemporary finance and economy. And then there are others, in this case this documentary, which I think also has a lot of positive sides, but I think there is a danger in what it does, in sort of establishing those false causalities and making sort of the system as such then innocent. And I think that's why we need to be very precise when talking about, okay, what do the arts do?
The last question.
Thank you very much. I think I have a question to both of you, really. Does it work? You hear me anyhow?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, we hear you.
I like the curating of this session because you seem to be addressing a common problem, namely that we have difficulties talking about finance. What are we precisely talking about? What do we address when we say finance? We have great problems with that, and lots of the critique of things happening in the contemporary world comes from our inability to really articulate what are we precisely addressing when we talk about finance. And then we have two very kind of explicit strategies to say we need a new vocabulary. So we talk about abstraction, or we talk about the spectral, and insisting, and I think I like that very much about both of your talks, that neither abstraction nor the spectral are metaphors. They are attempts to coin concepts with which we can talk about the reality of finance. And this reality might not be easily pinpointed as this thing. Here it is. Now we've got it. We need concepts. And then it just, after hearing both of you, I was kind of left with, it could be interesting to ask, could we talk about abstractions in terms of spectrality? And could we talk about spectrality in terms of abstraction? Just to kind of perhaps clarify the common endeavor that I see in your two papers. It's a demanding question, I think, because it challenges you to swap vocabularies all of a sudden. But it could be interesting to us, I think, to see how do these two strategies of talking about abstraction and spectrality actually work together. Because I think they work quite interesting.
Miriam, would you like to?
Yes, and maybe, I don't know if Leigh would like to join me here so we can, I don't know.
Towards the end.
Towards the end, okay, good. So I thought about that already when Leigh was presenting her work, and I was sort of thinking by myself, okay, actually it might be that the concept of spectrality, if we now start describing finance as spectral all the time, falls into the same trap as the concept of the abstract, which is then overused. Okay, finance is spectral, but what do we actually mean by that? And I told Leigh yesterday the story, this is my PhD work. I was in the moment of finalizing my PhD when I came across her article saying that we as scholars need to be more careful when we use the vocabulary of abstraction, and we need to maybe use different vocabularies of extraction, and there was the real abstraction and the second order, and so I had to go through the whole PhD from the start again and look, okay, where do I use the vocabulary abstract and which one fits best here? And I think the same might be needed for the concept of spectrality. But what I do like about the idea of spectrality, and I would rather describe it as a sort of container term that is just there to look at finance, is that it has this sort of disorienting quality. So specters are famous for the fact that they haunt us, right? So they sort of unsettle us. And what I found interesting about those images that I show, and there are maybe even more powerful examples in literature, where this idea of haunting is really sort of taken to the extremes, is that they make us uncomfortable and therefore make us think, at least, about finance. And I think that's what I like about this.
Okay, thank you very much.
But right now we have Ida Börjel and Erling. Ida is a poet based in Malmö. Hey. Erling is professor here at HDK. HDK is called the School of Design and Crafts. Maybe just craft. At University of Gothenburg. And their presentation is called Cute Counter-Narratives. Follow the money.
Thank you. We're going to talk about practice-based, art-based research project that we have done that has the city of Malmö as its case. And we've been looking at the kind of successful side of Malmö and how it is narrated and how we can counter-narrate it. So today we will do a presentation of partly of our findings, partly maybe meta-reflection on it and so forth. And so we've looked at the alpha territory, say, of Malmö, which we call kind of jokingly, and sometimes is called jokingly Malmhatten. So our project is called Follow the Money, and we've done a bunch of experiments about how to kind of aestheticize and do these counter-narratives. And some of them fail, and we are quite unhappy with them and so forth. But and you will find on this webpage a bunch of texts and films and so forth. So let's start the presentation.
Yes.
And we have a rolling PowerPoint. Yes. Okay. Quote, "Stop making us into laboratory rats," wrote Nabila Abdullah Fatah, etc., 16th of December 2014. Between 2000 and 2011, 345 research and development projects were started in the Rosengård in Malmö. 319 million Swedish kronor reporting to the projects. The school results were absent, and the job employment did not get better. The latest deadline for such a project just ended on 18th of November 2016, and I quote, "Responding to Europe's migration crisis, Opportunity Space is an international design-built competition to create a temporary mobile structure that will foster economic opportunity and social inclusion in Malmö, Sweden. The winning team will receive $10,000 in prize and up to $25,000 to implement the proposal in and around Malmö's Enskifteshagen Park. Flash competition, multidisciplinary teams of experts, intense projects. It led to international collaborators parachuting their solutions and then leave. It brings to mind the instant inflatable pneumatic parliament by Geisa Muller von der Hagen and Peter Sloterdijk. Instant democracy is still in vogue. A central concern for any designer or artist ought to be what infrastructure one is forced to relate to and is framed by, what infrastructure to engage in and not. Design and art objects always participate in assemblages of infrastructures, practices, and institutions. To make design and art therefore means to reshape and reassemble, which also takes apart previous assemblies, as Mahmoud Keshvars argues. Current co-design and relational art efforts are entangled in the machine of financialization capitalism, where we have seen the size of the financial sector has grown massively the last 30 years, and which has placed an increased emphasis on being able to quantify and measure value, the downsizing of state institutions and the increase of private micro-controlled bureaucracy, increased participatory placebo governance processes without any power, projective network fluidity and perpetual mobility and flexibility is believed to be good and has led to the increase of just-in-time labor contracts.
Just testing. It's okay. Quotes from various Swedish news media. The Swedish economy risks overheating. Sweden's economy is soon overheated. Currency war is vitamin injection for markets. About economics, the language of market thinking, finance, neoliberalism, Björn writes that although it is the dominant language of argument, it is met with lukewarm disinterest. It is to the point where one in many economics programs does not realize or does not want to realize
that one is in the business of language education and development. Why this disinterest, this ignorance about today's language of power, which in turn shapes and maintains our shared reality? Toscano and Kinkel asserts that what is at stake is the figurability or representability of our present and its shaping effect on political action. In a strong interpretation, the mapping of capitalism is a precondition for identifying any levers, nerve centers, or weak links in the political anatomy of contemporary domination. The bitter winds of financial politics. The Swedish economy stands strong when global winds blow. Despite Swedish economic growth outpacing comparable nations, storm clouds gather. What can be said in economics and what does silence ignore? Rombach again. Many metaphors within the language of economics invoke fundamental assumptions about human nature. Even when these assumptions are unreasonable and lack grounding in reality, they are in turn fundamental to many societies. An example of such a metaphor is that there is always scarcity, and that the individual's primary animating force is to obtain more.
The level of analytical abstraction has political aesthetic implications, which has been addressed today, both when it comes to the understanding what the scope of the site of intervention is and how the work conducted at the site can be understood. In their critique of Bruno Latour, who has been important to many co-designers engaged in so-called thinning of matters of concern through co-design projects, as we heard of before, Benjamin Noyes and Toscano and Kinkel show how Latour's flat ontology, where everything is treated equally, real, some entities such as critical left politics focused on macro explanations such as capitalism, are less real. They also point out how Latour claimed that leftist thought believes in central command and control center, or that Hegel and Marx produced pictures in the form of panoramas that had no gaps, and that's simply misguided, as they argue. In fact, they doubted Marx and Hegel in the possibility of producing a total overview, and strongly reflected on gaps and incoherencies. A shift Latour makes from capitalism to capitalisms leads to what Latour calls pixelation of politics, a shift of scale, Noyes states, that at first may appear to deflate the power of capitalism and open up for political critique. However, the attention to micropolitics by ignoring broader systemic oppressions, like many of the projects done in Rosengård, undermines critical intervention, since it does not acknowledge the function of real abstraction, real subsumption, and shaping form of agency. In City Fables, Follow the Money, we have engaged in studying and counter-narrating the public and private narratives that frame city life, and doing so through making an alternative chain of relations, by creating a room of our own rather than an assembly where all stakeholders have a claim upon the issue or the present. Because the world is not flat, and having all on board would have meant that our rearrangement would have been vetoed.
Using the fable as an organizing metaphor, we have inhabited the shadow land between fiction and documentary as the site of mapping strategies and counter-strategies for highlighting critical phenomena in the contemporary computerized, digitized, and quantified, proceduralized city. The fable and fabulation, our structuring principle, is also motivated etymologically in fabula, from the Latin for conversation, history, game. The fable as fictive story or uttering, which intends to present a useful truth, and then especially one in which animals speak and act as humans, and also false utterance, lie, opens up to questions such as how is success fabulated? Through what kind of framing can the current system be criticized and rendered visible in light of our limited options for commenting upon something in which we ourselves are implicated? Mikael Hart asserts that language offers a model for understanding the crisis in contemporary capitalist economy, since the world of finance is characterized by and functions through linguistic conventions, and the newly dominant forms of labor are produced through language and means analogous to linguistic performance. Much media attention and research and development projects have focused on the so-called poor and troubled neighborhoods of Malmö. Very little critical research has been conducted on what produces the successful, so to speak, side of Malmö. If so, it has focused on the green and the sustainable aspects of the Western Harbour. The lack led us to study the finance and new media district, where also a sizable part of Malmö University is located, which played a central role in reinventing Malmö after a post-industrial decline.
When studying the successful side, we have had as our starting point corporate taxes, because corporate taxes is the central arena of negotiation between the public and private. In the project, we have conducted interviews with politicians, government agencies, companies, auditing companies, activists to gather their voices on taxes. We've also analyzed economic data from 2,400 companies located in Malmhattan. We've also documented aggressive tax planning products in our everyday life. We've also struggled with how to narrate our findings from blog posts, cutout animation films, which we did together with Hanna Sköld and Patrick, and some of the students at Valand Film. Now I lost where I am. Yeah, and hand puppet play performances that we sometimes, when we use these hand puppets. We did not want to copy the dramaturgical language used when dealing with finance and tax avoidance, which often uses a murky, mysterious, thriller-like language. Instead, what we have aimed to unearth is a social life of money and taxes by connecting the abstract of capital to the sense data of everyday perception and experience through what CNNG terms as cuteness. Our work builds also on Frederick James's notion of cognitive mapping, given that we live in a time dominated by capitalism. Jameson argues that any aesthetic cultural expressions are based on social spaces and class relations generated by capitalism. He therefore argues for an aesthetic that addresses the legibility of such spaces and relations. We have asked ourselves how we can connect the abstraction of capital to the sense data of everyday perception, and how such representation of political teaching can shape and affect political action by identifying nerve centers or weak links in political anatomy and contemporary domination. And as Toscano and Kinkel argue, the difficulty is to attend to how we are subject to abstract forces while avoiding treating this abstraction as mystification or a natural force that cannot be narratively reversed. Put differently, there seems to be ideological forces located elsewhere that configures economical data and societal narratives so they benefit themselves in their affluent position. And it's a difficult task to kind of rethink or re-narrate them. In fact, much of the cultural depiction of capital that Toscano and Kinkel analyze are cliché, flatten social relations and fetishize capital while claiming to critique it. And I think we've seen some good examples of that today.
Yeah, I think so too. Also the Toscana Kinkel quote about us being puppets of value, which maybe we can talk about more later. A few words on economisch, the language as ideology. In his little pamphlet book, Capitalist Realism, Mark Fisher underscores that an ideological position cannot be truly successful until it has been neutralized. And it cannot be neutralized as long as it is regarded as value rather than reality. Consequently, neoliberalism has attempted to eliminate the ethical significance of the value category. For the past 30 years, a form of capitalist realism has successfully been established through a corporate ontology, whereby it simply is obvious that everything in society, including public health and medical care, education, and family life, should be run like a corporation. Entrepreneurial spirit, flexibility, reform friendliness, transparency, freedom, competition state instead of welfare state, consumer instead of citizen. It is striking, writes Sebastian Müller, how originally positive terms were devalued analogous to selective recreations or reinterpretations. The social state is targeted in particular. If it was an epitome for solidarity, social security, justice, and democracy in the 1960s and 70s, it has been subjected to vehement attacks, at least since the 1990s. Welfare, dictatorship, and so on. Neoliberalism bridges the political parties and spans all areas of human activity. Homo economicus as a fundamental behavioral model for all branches of social science. What, Morazzi wonders, is the interpretive model for facts, and how is it dominant? How does it acquire the legitimacy that allows it to determine the actions of the multiplicity of players participating in the economic and financial game?
The narrative of Malmö portrays the city as either vibrant and creative place, and for those of you that don't know Malmö is probably the most contested city in Sweden, and big newspapers in Stockholm would have, a series on Malmö to discuss it. So it's either portrayed as vibrant and creative place, or as a violent, criminal, dangerous place that is being overtaken by migrants. Like many harbor cities, the city of Malmö reinvented itself after a post-industrial decline. Mukta Landgren shows that the new city policy serum found in policy documents and marketing materials contains positive substances such as to increase knowledge-based entrepreneurial work that attracts the well-educated, build attractive harbor houses, provide a vibrant multicultural city life and cheap services of mainly women migrants to attract capital. The problematic ingredients typically blamed on migration are increased unemployment and segregation. And to quote the mayor back then, Ilmar Reepalu, this is what he said: at the same time as the safe industry disappeared, large groups of immigrants moved to the city and the number of unemployment increased. Such statements contributed to cementing the view that increased unemployment decreased growth and was due to migration rather than global economic forces.
And more recently, the report Malmö's Road to a More Sustainable Future acknowledges that Malmö is a highly unequal city which is mirrored in the health of the population. Consequently, it states that the poorer and unhealthier part of Malmö needs to be helped through participatory bottom-up processes.
And 2 decades later, Malmö has mainly seen the establishment of global corporate headquarters and service companies. These binaries reproduce an increased spatial difference and inequalities. Rosengård is seen as an immigrant district and problematic, while the Western Harbour comes to stand for the prosperous future. They have been taken for granted truths rather than as Mukta lumbering states, referring to massive as political processes that produce the city. Our interest in corporate taxes, beside that we consider it important nerve center, is because taxes could be a way to ensure the government receive money from companies to pay for debts generated by companies, which have increasingly been socialized, as we all know, since the crash of 2008. Those willing to take large risk and through it damage the economy should pay for the cost, some argue.
Tax relief. When we hear that term, the situation is automatically ascribed a burden, a victim of the burden, as well as someone who relieves us of it. Without relief, suffering continues. As a decoding method, George Lakoff suggests the concept of framing, where he states that the frames are in the synapses of our brains, physically present in the form of neural circuitry. When the facts don't fit the frames are kept and the facts ignored.
When approaching the topic of tax, we struggle to understand contemporary economics and workings of companies, accounting, and tax laws. At times it felt incomprehensible and complexity obfuscating. For example, when going through this 2,400 company data and their annual reports, and how they are structured and how transactions between mother and daughter companies flow between jurisdictions and so forth, which generates complex geographies. In counter-narrating and counter-mapping the data, we aim to redistribute both through practice and mediation the sensible by devaluing and revaluing the elements that make up the unifying meaning, and through it produce fissures and cracks, and taking for granted the normative representational practices. Devaluing as a strategy acknowledge the necessary violence of negation, rather than an affirmation of power, which seems to be the Latourian idea. Violence is inhuman because it rejects the norm of the big other. It is, in Noy's words, it is violence in a sense of rupture of the usual coordinates of existence, a kind of unworrying post precisely against the unbearable lightness of capitalist being. One of our films, titled The Great Subsidy Party, counter-narrates subsidies. Currently we think of the sick, old, and migrants as those receiving most subsidies from the state, draining our shared resources. As we all know, the sick and the old are now pitted against the migrants. But what if corporations that put themselves cunningly in debt and as lower the results in their corporate taxes can be seen as getting substantial subsidies from the state? This, we argue, is similar to how individuals and families have large house loans receive substantial subsidies from the state through making debt attractive. And now we will show you one of the films that we did together with Anders and Patrick, which is called The Great Subsidy Party. So it's an attempt to address this.
Men det är inte alltid man klarar sig själv. Vi vill vara självständiga, men för det behövs andras hjälp. Nu äger 1%. Vi strävar efter frihet, men det är inte alltid man klarar sig själv. Vi vill vara självständiga, men för det behövs andras hjälp. Nu äger 1% av de rikaste rika halva världen. Är du en av de behövande som kämpar med att få det att gå runt?
Jag vill också bli berättad i en framgångssaga. Vara en vinnare, ligga i solen med havre, mjölk och barn. Det är mer min stil. Inte det här. Hålla på och gneta och gno.
Och det är bara idioter som betalar skatt.
Dags att börja skatteplanera. Finns mycket godis där. Framgångsrecept punkt 1. Ha eller bli själv ett företag. För utan företagen slocknar Sverige och staten låter inte Sverige slockna. Alltså rädda staten företagen.
De säger att skattebördan är tung att bära. Hur många tror ni betalar 22%? I Malmö betalar 1/3 av företagen 0 kronor i skatt.
Punkt 2. Skaffa dig en fiffig revisor. En av de 4 stora.
When you wish upon a star makes no difference who you are. Hallå, jag menar hur kan då de företag klara sig som betalar in sina 22%? Och hur kommer man undan med att inte betala? Det är väl olagligt?
Det kallas skatteplanering. Inget fusk. Juridiskt sett.
Ja, så i princip bokför man pengar under olika etiketter. Gärna då utomlands.
Alltså det är jättedyrt att driva företag. Man lever under ständig press och då behövs en morot. Och det får man av staten. Ja, det är bara att slå upp ett företags årsredovisning. Hur mycket har de betalt in i skatt? Är svaret någon? Då har man ju fått 22% i form av en statlig subvention. Ett skattebidrag helt enkelt.
Okej. Bidrag i form av en kostnad som man slipper betala.
Staten betalar 1/3 av alla räntekostnader för bolån. 85% av dessa går till de rikaste hushållen i form av sänkt skatt. Ett bostadsbidrag.
Punkt 3. Din boplats är en skattesats. Staten har sockrat bostadslånen med 30 miljarder de senaste åren.
Nu är jag med. Ränteavdrag lockar till att låna mer. Och mer. Och mer och mer och mer. Mer. Vägen till framgång går över skuldberget.
Och årets nolla är Gripen AB. Kommentar?
Va? Tack. Vi är ett bolag med 49 anställda, omsättning 284 miljoner. Skatten landade på minus 921 000 och årets resultat minus 9 miljoner.
Majoriteten av våra skattepengar går till skola, sjukvård, äldreomsorg. Förlossning 25 år. Särskilt boende i äldreomsorgen 803 165 000 kronor per år. Grundskola 92 600 kronor per år.
Vi är alla beroende.
Vi är alla beroende. Vilka bidrag lever du på?
Vilket bidrag lever du på?
This is partly, I mean, the strong idea has been that trickle-down economics, we need to get companies to Malmö and then they will bring in a lot of taxes, and then when we look at a pretty much 60% of the companies in a success area pay almost nothing in taxes. So it's a kind of interesting imaginary, and then the picture also that they are, suffering from this tax burden and so forth. So subjects are, according to Jeff Kinkel and Toscano, in many of the most crucial aspects of social existence, puppet of value. They suggest a materialist prosopopeia, one rhetorical figure to tackle the representability of complex abstraction like capital, which determine in often overpowering ways the action of individuals and collectives. We chose to use the animals and as ventriloquists, as commentators and boundary objects can move our perception of who can comment and and because they are tricksters and consumers that are difficult to place and because they are so cute.
And since cuteness is an aestheticization of powerlessness, as Sian and Guy writes in her book, Our Aesthetic Categories, and since soft contours suggest pliancy or responsiveness to the will of others, the less formally articulated the commodity, the cuter. Noting that there is a sadistic side to this tender emotion, Guy concludes that cuteness has become paradoxically central to late capitalist culture. But she continues in accordance with Laurie Merish. The fact that the cute object seems capable of making an effective demand on the subject is already a sign that cute does not just denote a static power differential, but rather a dynamic and complex power struggle. The second film, and it's Is There Swedish Coffee in Panama?
Från myndigheter. De har de bästa förutsättningar. I vårt världsomspännande nätverk av specialister på skattepolitik och skattetvister finns före detta toppchefer från myndigheter. De har de bästa förutsättningar att hjälpa dig med proaktiv hantering av risker för att undvika konflikter med skattemyndigheterna. I Panama Leaks utgjorde politiker den största gruppen skatteplanerare. Men i Sverige jobbar man på en lösning, säger skatteutskottets vice ordförande. För, tillägger han, fortsätter det här med att undergräva välfärden.
Till exempel under Malmö Stadshuskoncernens första år slussades vinster på 162 miljoner kronor runt inom koncernen, främst från bostadsbolaget MKB. Till synes för att täcka förlustaffärerna Malmö Live och Stadsteatern.
Ta du den biten så fortsätter jag med det jätteviktiga här.
Kommunalrådet svarade. Det är pengar som inte betalas in i skatt utan används för det som pengarna från början var tänkta för. Kommunal verksamhet.
Så istället för att komma hyresgästerna till godo pumpas hyrespengarna in i skrytbyggen. Man kan säga som en extra beskattning.
Den lokala oppositionen sa: det här är 100% skatteplanering.
Regeringen tillför en till forskning och högre utbildning.
Men de ger med ena handen och tar dubbelt åter med den andra. Man tänker plocka ut 6,5 miljarder i vinst från akademiska hus.
Jaha, men det tycker inte jag.
Om ett företag har en fabrik utomlands, då ska de betala en källskatt där. Källskattens storlek förhandlas fram av politiker. Sverige är ett av de länder som betalar minst i källskatt. Afrikanska länder går miste om flera 100 miljoner euros om året på nedpressade källskatter.
För de här överföringarna kan också beskattas i en överföringsskatt, en så kallad källskatt, som då tillfaller Sydafrika. Och det här regleras av skatteavtal som regeringarna i Sydafrika och Sverige förhandlat fram.
Låg källskatt lockar svenska företag att investera mer utomlands, men har huvudkontoret kvar här hemma. Yes?
Nej. Flera rapporter visar att låga källskatter inte leder till fler investeringar. Företagen får billig arbetskraft utan att betala skatt till samhällsbygget. I gengäld skickar politikerna här för biståndspengar med en vänlig hälsning.
Om utländska företag däremot hade betalt rimligt mycket skatt så hade behovet av bistånd reducerats.
Skatteutskottets vice ordförande sa att nu får det bli slut på dumheterna genom ny internationell skattelagstiftning. Politikern sa: samtidigt ska den svenska skattevälfärden finansieras. Det är den balansen vi måste hitta. Men skatteutskottets vice ordförande känner inte till detta. Jag får erkänna, säger skatteutskottets vice ordförande. Jag har inte hunnit läsa rapporten.
Men bry sig, jag menar, orka.
Ignorans är ofta inte bara en avsaknad av kunskap, utan resultatet av en kulturell och politisk kamp.
Thanks folks, and once again, welcome back.
So basically, in this film, we're kind of arguing that politicians are claiming to change it, but they're actually playing the corporate game themselves. And it's interesting to think about when the government becomes more and more like the corporations, that they're supposed to be kind of maybe stifling a bit. And with the film, we want to complicate the myth that the Swedish government is a steady guardian of common good. It appears as if the Swedish government, by protecting their own welfare, is willing to limit other governments to uphold the same, while ensuring that their self-image of being just and humanitarians is tattered. And the mechanism for this myth is to frame the story by letting conflictual and contradictory aspects fall outside the frame, which we in the film have wanted to bring back into the picture. So, I mean, we interviewed the vice president of the tax committee, and he is talking, in this very way that we have such high moral here, and we can help the African countries to get better tax administration. While it turns out that there is a report from Eurodad that shows that Sweden is one of the most aggressive countries. The Swedish government is one of the most aggressive governments of the OECD countries of negotiating low source tax on the continent of Africa. We should end it. We're almost done. Sorry for...
Economish Red's Patrik Zapata Johansson convinces us that it renders problems isolated and possible to solve. The only thing necessary to solve problems is money. Questions of morals, humans' feelings and justice do not need to be considered because they are not visible in the manifestation of the problem. There, what arises is costs and revenue. For example, that a victim of an exploded mine cost $3,000. Oh, no more than that, I'll take 2. In addition, Berge states that economics as political strategy intends to shape our behavior and our perceptions. The rhetoric of this strategy is characterized by an abundance of metaphors, where language is traded and valued according to how it performs. Effectiveness, not truth value, is the operation of language. This, he says, suggests that what is science and fiction is itself highly contested.
In the Malmö Commission's final report concerning the city's health disparities, Sven Olaf Isaksson concluded that health and medical care is critical to our health. But if one truly wants to change, one must alter those social structures, physical as well as social, as the ultimate cause behind those risk factors that bring about poor health, injuries, and premature death. As Müller points out, personal responsibility transforms the disgrace of poverty to become the private disgrace of the poor. That very idea of freedom in the self-image of neoliberalism is limited to market freedom, is completely suppressed.
In accordance, Mark Fisher writes that capitalist realism insists on treating mental health as if it were a natural fact, like weather, but then again, weather is no longer a natural fact so much as political economic effect. It is necessary to reframe the growing problem of stress in capitalist societies. Instead, that is, of accepting the vast privatization of stress, we need to ask, how has it become acceptable that so many people, and especially so many young people, are ill?
Thank you very much. Time is running. We have about 10 minutes for questions and comments to Ida and to Erling. Who would like to start?
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. I would like to ask a question about fiction, or fabulation, or narration, because I thought it was very interesting that you brought up this axis of fact versus fiction in a way that resonates with the earlier axis of, I don't know, the abstract and the concrete and the imaginary and the spectral and the real. But you had sort of, a concept of fiction at stake. And thinking of Franco Berardi and Mark Fisher, the question is also one of, the artists, but also of the scientists and critical academics. Because the question is, how do you counter the fictions, the myths of capitalism, or of capitalist realism? Do you go about the problem by, in a rather old school way of, revealing or unveiling the myths and satisfying yourself with, saying, okay, this is obviously false, now I will show you the way things really are, and now I can show you, the light. Or do you go about the way that you seem to go about it, creating counter-narratives, as you call them? So my question is, I guess, could you elaborate on that endeavor of, creating counter-narratives or creating, fictions while you're doing science?
It's a tricky question, and we've struggled with it, and sometimes we're just, some days we're like, oh God, what have we done? It's, it doesn't work, and so forth, and it's hard because to some degree we've collected a lot of empirical data, from the chief lawyer from PricewaterhouseCoopers to the vice president of the tax council and so forth. So we are using that, but And maybe I would say, even though we're doing it through these animals and so forth, maybe sometimes actually some of these films are falling back too much to a realist kind of tradition, you know, believing that we can kind of just depict reality. So I think, I don't know if maybe you want to take on, I could say more, but I think actually that's one, looking back at this, I think sometimes maybe we could have worked in a different register, acknowledging actually, which you write about in an interesting way in your book, that text have a homological structure that is like the economy, rather than something that you can kind of extract from reality, this kind of simplified abstraction.
Yeah, I can only add that, you know, you hear a lot about demystifying finance, and you can add Xian and Guy, as I mentioned, her what she says about the sublime and beauty, maybe. I guess one question could be also that it depends on what you want to do with it. Do you want revolution? Do you want to write a good poem? Do you want to engage in people education? And I think that last point was something that we aimed for it, because one thing that one part that is striking to me is that people, and that's including myself, tend to look so exhausted when you start to talk about finance and economy, and they're just too tired. It's almost like this behavioral bell ringing. People just are too tired to grasp it. Either they say, well, I know this already, or who is surprised, or and that is a problem. So any take on it, maybe, but maybe with a question of how do we create energy enough so that we are able to think and talk about it, and not just accepting that this is the only alternative.
But you had an audience for these kind of animations. You were thinking of showing it in some sort of context for some people somewhere.
We were hoping, and that's why we chose this kind of aesthetics and working with it. Yes.
And obviously, I mean, we had a kind of pedagogical or ambition with them somehow, because I mean the easy game in aesthetics would to be play this smart aesthetic game of we understand the market and we can also be as kind of tricksy as they are. So, and pedagogically oriented art is extremely despised in the art world, right? So, as a category. So, it's also, we're also playing with that. Can we actually revitalize certain parts of aesthetics that has been despised?
Yes.
I just wanted to follow up on your question. I really appreciated the way that you posed it, and I also appreciated your response to it. And I don't so much have an answer, but I guess I did want to make one comment, which is I do think the site that you two have chosen, which is the taxation as mediation, that to me seems extremely promising, much more so than were it to be money or debt or finance. Because I think the idea of taxation, it produces a kind of local and global geography and imaginary. And I think that whatever aesthetic strategy you end up going with, that as a site of mediation positions you so well to move between the kind of requisite abstraction and concretization that could be generative of a knowledge or a discourse.
Would you like to comment on that?
Thank you.
Thank you. The comment is thank you. We have time for one last question before we have to close. Any volunteers?
I'm interested in the method of your data collection, actually, because so far we've been hearing about the mystery of this financial world, and you seem to have managed to actually uncover something. So and also it's in relation to your title, Follow the Money, and yeah, so did you actually follow the money, and how did you do it?
Well, concretely, we had to make our own method, but we contacted like a company called Alla Bolag, because they're actually cheaper than the government.
But that's the first thing, you have to pay for the knowledge if you want to try and find it.
Yeah, the government has the same data, but they were a lot more expensive. So we went to Alla Bolag and we want company data on all companies within this postal code. And then we just got an Excel file, and then we hired a controller to do analysis according to things that we were asking. And then we went through 250 annual reports after the filtering, besides then interviews we did with a bunch of people.
Suddenly sounds so simple.
So some data is available, but it's not for free. And that, I think, will be the last word for now. On your way out, there are lots of sandwiches here for anybody who feels that that's a good way to start dinner. Take a look at the poster sitting next to the fiction and finance poster. That's for a coming conference and seminar based on art and migration. It will take place here on Friday the 19th of October. It's also hosted by PARSE, right? Erling will share that, I think, or at least participate. Thank you, Leigh. Thank you, Miriam. Thank you, Ida. And thank you, Erling. And thanks to all of you.